We ready to go?
I'm ready, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today. The subcommittee is meeting here today to receive testimony on the northern border, Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic, Part 1. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare subcommittee in recess at any time. I want to thank you, Ranking Member Lesko, and our panel of witnesses for joining us here today. Welcome. Today's hearing will discuss a changing Arctic and U.S. strategic interests in that region, specifically priorities for securing the homeland. A changing climate has already led to diminishing sea ice, opening up parts of the Arctic for increased economic and maritime activity. Sadly, our government is ill-prepared for this new reality. I'm concerned that the aggressive actions of other nations, namely Russia and China, threaten to undermine the international order. Russia has expanded its military installations and footprint in the Arctic, investing heavily in a large icebreaker fleet of more than 50 icebreakers, reviving Cold War bases and deep water ports, and of course, solidifying infrastructure in the region as well. China has also made its Arctic ambitions very clear, declaring itself a near Arctic state, and despite being located 1,000 miles away and investing strategically in economic activity in key geographic areas in the region. And China is investing in what it calls a polar Silk Road. Russia and China both stand to profit significantly from trade routes that will become increasingly passable as ice shelves continue to recede. The image on the screens, the images there, show the potential benefit of a northern sea route through the Arctic. According to the Washington Post, the northern sea route, shown in orange, traverses 8,000 miles from East Asia to Western Europe. And that's about 5,000 miles shorter than the current route shown in blue. The Northern Sea Route will enable China to ship goods to Europe in about 2 weeks faster than it can now, and it will provide Russia the opportunity to charge ships a fee to travel through waters over which it can claim jurisdiction. Along with the new shipping routes, melted ice in the Arctic will allow for increased tourism, fisheries, energy exploration, and infrastructure development. With these new opportunities come major challenges for us. First, we must ensure that the Arctic development is sustainable with minimal impact to the environment and supportive of local communities, including the indigenous people. Next, we must ensure that the U.S. Coast Guard is prepared to execute its multifaceted missions in this changing region. The Coast Guard's mission in the Arctic includes port security, search and rescue, regulation of shipping and fishing, law enforcement, and support of scientific research. The Coast Guard is also responsible for maintaining a U.S. presence in our territorial waters and defending our security and economic interests in the region. The Coast Guard, however, is constantly being asked to do more with less. For example, the Coast Guard has a major icebreaking capability gap, and currently the Coast Guard has only 2 polar icebreakers, one which is a heavy-duty icebreaker and the other one which is dedicated to the Arctic operations. The Coast Guard has stated that 6 polar security cutters will be necessary to successfully execute its mission in the Arctic. Congress has made significant investments in modernizing Coast Guard assets, including a fiscal year 2019 funds to begin construction of its first new polar security cutter. It will not be until the delivery of a second polar security cutter in 2025 or later, however, that the Coast Guard will have a heavy-duty ice-breaking capability in the Arctic. In the meantime, the Coast Guard will need to use other resources and capabilities to meet its Arctic mission to the best of its ability. This committee works hard to ensure the Coast Guard and its DHS partners have the authorities and direction needed to protect the homeland. Sadly, the current administration consistently makes DHS's mission more difficult. And in fact, the Coast Guard's mission is often overlooked and deemed as a secondary status. The President has repeatedly attempted to raid the DHS budget to pay for a southern border wall above all else. And this ignores critical security needs throughout the country, including at our maritime borders. Additionally, at a time when international cooperation and leadership in the Arctic is sorely needed, the administration has failed to prioritize diplomacy in the region, scrapping the State Department's position of special representative for the Arctic. We need to invest more in U.S. government capabilities in the Arctic, not less, in order to assure that the Coast Guard and its partners can secure the homeland at our northernmost border. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the scope of Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic and recommendations to address them. I look forward to holding a Part 2 hearing at a future date so we can hear directly from the Coast Guard and other government partners on this most important topic. And now, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from the state of Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses here, and welcome to the audience. And I was just saying we were going to agree on just about everything until you got to the part where you said the Trump administration isn't doing anything, because they
I didn't
are.
say Trump.
Okay. The current administration isn't doing anything, but that I disagree with you on, and I'll actually reference it in my statement. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our shared interest in this topic, and I appreciate you convening today's hearing to learn more about what the Department of Homeland Security can contribute to our position in the Arctic. As one of 8 countries with a geographic footprint within the Arctic Circle, the region is one of great national importance to the United States, and I think we agree on that. The area is abundant with natural resources, has immense value for scientific research, is a strategic position for national security purposes, and offers significant benefit to commerce and maritime shipping. Considerable changes are also taking place in the Arctic that will allow these potential benefits to be realized to a greater extent while also making U.S. action more urgent. Changes in the levels of seasonal sea ice in the Arctic Ocean have allowed for increased transit through the area, while also increasing interest from other Arctic countries like Russia and even non-Arctic countries like China. In a renewed era of great power competition, one thing we can all agree on is the need to ensure the United States' national security is in the face of growing influence in the Arctic from Russia and China. As commerce grows in the region, U.S. interests and freedom of navigation must be protected if we are to fully realize the potential opportunities in a changing Arctic. The United States Coast Guard has a diverse range of missions as a component of the Department of Homeland Security, and recently I was able to tour with them, and it was a great experience. Drug interdiction, environmental enforcement, search and rescue, as well as port security are all responsibilities of the United States Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is also the sole owner and operator of the United States Polar Capable Fleet, and thus best placed to facilitate the United States' sovereign presence in the Arctic. And yet, as the chairman has noted, the United States Coast Guard relies on a single, aging, heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, to conduct polar operations. As with any aging platform, the Solar Star suffers from frequent mechanical issues that can result in the need for maintenance at sea. In an attempt to remedy this situation, Congress, with the support of President Trump, enacted funding for the first new polar icebreaker in last year's appropriations. While funding a new heavy icebreaker is an important first step, it is imperative that this action is only the beginning of our nation's Arctic conversation. The Coast Guard stated a need for 3 new heavy polar security cutters and 3 medium polar security cutters in 2013. Since then, we have funded the first heavy polar security cutter, as well as the Trump administration has financed long lead time materials for the second cutter. To maintain the United States position in the Arctic during this dynamic period, we must consider the benefits of our Arctic activity beyond just the military. We must recognize the importance of this mission and continue to direct our attention and investment to the Arctic region if we want to continue our sovereign presence. With renewed Coast Guard capability and continued national focus in the Arctic region, our usage and presence will continue to grow through increased commerce, research, and even tourism as we are able to transit more of the Arctic Ocean for longer periods of time. That is what we will need in order to truly bolster our presence in the Arctic region as other great powers like Russia and China seek to project their own. This is a complex problem that requires complex solutions to achieve our nation's desired result. Many scholarly organizations are focused on this issue. We'll hear from some today. And I look forward to hearing from you guys today. Whether that solution is continued investment, interagency efforts, existing international initiatives, or new international initiatives, Congress must set a new course for U.S. focus on the Arctic. So again, thank you for being here today. I look forward to hearing more about this. I wish more people were here because I guess we're going to have the secret and be able to solve it together, Mr. Correa.
Ms. Lesko, I think you might have just come up with a solution, the less the better, to fix this problem. But with that being said, I'd like to also welcome our ranking member of the Homeland Security Full Committee, and that's Representative Rogers from the good state of Alabama. I'd like to recognize him for an opening statement. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, and I appreciate you holding this important hearing, and I appreciate the leadership of Ranking Member Lesko on this important issue. It is critical that we recognize the growing strategic importance of the Arctic to the U.S. interest. Russia and China are making significant investments in the Arctic. To them, the Arctic is a new battlefield where they are seeking every advantage over the United States. The United States must not be caught flat-footed. To defend our national security, homeland security, and sovereignty, we must make needed investments in Arctic infrastructure. To that end, I'm pleased that Congress has funded 1 new polar security cutter for the Coast Guard and has appropriated funding for long lead materials for a second. These heavy icebreakers are long overdue, and once delivered will greatly improve the Coast Guard's capabilities and presence in the region. I thank each of the witnesses for appearing before this committee today to help improve our understanding of the homeland security implications of changing Arctic, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Now, I would like to welcome the panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Dr. Michael Sfara, is the director of the Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Wilson Center. His work is focused on changing geography in the Arctic and the impacts of social and political regimes in the region. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes for statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lesko and members of the committee. As the chairman noted, I'm the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program. Members, today we are witnessing the opening of a new ocean, a 4th accessible maritime border for the United States. The Arctic Ocean joins the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific Ocean as a critical geographic component of our country's maritime ring of security and opportunity. Spanning nearly 5.5 million square miles, the Arctic Ocean covers an area roughly 1.5 times the United States and half the size of the African continent. It is a region we cannot ignore. My testimony provides an overview of key issues facing the U.S., other Arctic and non-Arctic nations. I'd like to reconceptualize the risks, the realities, and the opportunities in the Arctic. I provide a new framework called Navigating the Arctic's 7 Cs. The Cs are climate, commodities, commerce, connectivity, communities, cooperation, and competition. To effectively protect the homeland by addressing the challenges and opportunities of a transformed Arctic, the United States must thoroughly consider how it navigates the Arctic's 7 seas. The first C is climate. You'll hear more about that in a moment. But climate change is real, it is rapid, and it is palpable. According to NASA, September Arctic Ocean ice extent has decreased from about 3 million square miles in 1980 to less than 2 million square miles this month. The latest IPCC report found with high confidence that the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. The second C is commodities. According to the USGS, the Arctic is estimated to hold 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas. The increased availability of these resources due to the rapid thaw in the Arctic has re-energized the global market's interest in the Arctic. This interest is predicted to endure, particularly in the wake of the recent attack on the Saudi Arabian oil facilities. The third C is commerce. Russia's Yamal Peninsula is now emblematic of the new global Arctic. For example, China owns nearly 30% of the initial Yamal LNG project, and Arctic LNG tankers are built in the shipyards of South Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. does not have a major deepwater port along 1,500 nautical miles of its Arctic coastline, from Dutch Harbor to Prudhoe Bay along the North Slope. Without a viable deepwater port or strings of ports in the U.S. Arctic, commerce, search and rescue, and national security interests will not be met. The June 2019 National Defense Authorization Act includes, quote, requirements to locate and designate one or more U.S. strategic ports. The fourth C, connectivity. We tend to think of connectivity just as an internet connection, but we should focus on a broader application of connectivity, addressing both digital and physical infrastructure. We do not have a digital or information divide in America's Arctic. We have a digital and information abyss. Less than 5% of the U.S. maritime Arctic is charted to modern international standards. We lack the basic information about our Arctic domain. Insufficient access to reliable internet connectivity hinders education, commerce, search and rescue, and impedes informed infrastructure development and maintenance. The fifth C is communities. The transformation of the Arctic most acutely affects communities in the region. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has identified 31 Alaskan communities as seriously threatened by environmental change and the imminent need for relocation. These threatened communities are similar perhaps to those in New Orleans or even a future Miami. 6, cooperation. For over 2 decades, the Arctic Council, a consensus-driven body, has fostered and maintained international dialogue, research efforts, and binding agreements among the members, including Russia. Cooperation also exists within the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, with representation from each Arctic nation. The Arctic region is the only place, aside from the International Space Station, where the U.S. and Russia have maintained long-term cooperation, even in times of high tension. And finally, Mr. Chairman, my final C is competition. The ability to project power in the Arctic can be measured in a number of ways, including a nation's ability to operate in the region. China, which in 2019, as you noted, proclaimed itself a near-Arctic state, and Mr. Chairman, I'm a geographer. They are not a near-Arctic state. Currently has 4 icebreakers and is developing 2 new icebreakers, 1 nuclear-powered. Russia operates, as you noted, over 50 icebreakers with 6 under construction and 12 more planned. Russia is also revitalizing Soviet-era military installations and establishing new assets along its northern sea route, with new military bases from Franz Josef Land to Wrangel Island. This denotes Russia's intent and ability to maintain premier influence in the Arctic. The U.S. government, by comparison, as you noted, has 2 icebreakers and is cannibalizing parts of the dry dock Polar Sea to maintain 1 single heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star. The recent funding for an additional U.S. icebreaker or Polar Security Cutter is a step forward. The U.S. Coast Guard's 2019 Arctic Strategic Outlook describes the need for 6 new Polar Security Cutters, which will help support our homeland security requirements and provide much-needed domain presence. We should share a sense of urgency to see our Polar Security Cutter fleet fully funded and in service sooner rather than later. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we often hear that the Arctic is an emerging issue. I disagree. The Arctic has emerged. As I have explained, it is no longer an isolated, remote region. Rather, it is a critical component of our global political, economic, social, physical, and security landscape. The region is experiencing rapid and dynamic change, and these 7 unique drivers, these Arctic 7 Cs, help frame these pressing global issues in a way that may help to better understand and address our future Arctic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Straga. And now our next witness, Dr. Abby Tingstad, the Associate Research Department Director of the Engineering and Applied Sciences at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Tingstad has authored a number of publications on the Arctic, and she has done extensive research on the Coast Guard capabilities, international cooperation, and the changing strategic environment in the Arctic. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and other distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. We have known for many years that the Arctic region is sensitive to environmental shifts, and today it is experiencing one of the most rapid rates of climate change in the world. These changes in the Arctic have created both homeland security and international issues. The northern rim of the United States is already an area of concern for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, search and rescue, and environmental protection. In the future, trafficking and terrorism-related problems could arise as well. In addition, the Arctic presents possibilities for both engagement and conflict with Russia and China in and near U.S. territory. Why does climate change in the Arctic matter, and what could the United States do about it from a security perspective? In the past, vast, harsh conditions, persistent sea ice, and limited opportunities for economic development have served as a deterrent to presence in the region. Climate is changing patterns of physical access to the Arctic. Maritime access is increasing, although unevenly, and land-based access in some areas is also decreasing. But climate is not the sole driver of change in the Arctic. For example, technology is also very important. New sensors and autonomous vehicles, for example, could increase the accessibility of the Arctic across land, sea, and air. And other change factors also motivate or discourage access to the region, such as the availability and cost of energy resources, as well as indigenous autonomy and partnerships. Among others, Russia and China are definitely taking advantage of opportunities in the Arctic. Russia is revitalizing fixed and mobile infrastructure for commercial and military use. For its part, China has been promoting the Polar Silk Road and engaging in Arctic affairs through the Arctic Council, among other things. Our work on the durability of Arctic cooperation among stakeholders revealed that an increase in maritime safety and security incidents might be most likely to bring Arctic security into question for the U.S. Examples of such incidents include maritime vessel collisions, dark vessels engaging in illegal fishing or drug running, oil spills, and acts of terrorism or piracy. Nations that appear to lack adequate capabilities to prevent and respond to these types of incidents will face a real or perceived security void in the Arctic. This will result in both domestic and international consequences, to include potential declines in well-being for indigenous communities, and a security void might also allow other nations, notably China and Russia, to justify an increase in presence and influence in the region. Now that environmental access barriers are falling, we must ask, how does climate change alter the needs and abilities of the U.S. government to carry out responsibilities and use its authorities in the Arctic? Ultimately, the United States must decide on the right level of national capability, and by virtue of its history and authorities, the U.S. Coast Guard will play a large role in any steps towards enhancing governance in the region. In our work on U.S. Coast Guard capabilities, several assets arose in our analysis as being particularly pertinent to Arctic operations. In addition to existing and planned icebreakers, these include helicopters, aircraft, airfields, national security cutters, medical evacuation capabilities, satellite and other communication networks, rescue coordination centers, and various types of specialist personnel, as well as data. Importantly, no single one of these capabilities arose as a silver bullet, and there are also many gaps still existing for the Coast Guard and others in the Arctic as well, to include communications, domain awareness, and response. Specific types of mitigation options that we identified in our work include a diverse range, including items such as communications infrastructure, remotely controlled air, sea, and amphibious craft for domain awareness, updating data gathering and database construction processes to enable fusion of information, and sustaining both longer-term operations as well as agile first response capability, among a series of other things. It is important to recognize that concerns about Arctic security and closing capability gaps are more than just Coast Guard issues. They are matters of national relevance. In addition to taking specific actions outlined, such as those I've just mentioned, the U.S. has the opportunity to continue work with the Arctic Council and Arctic Coast Guard Forum. Finding ways to keep discussion channels open for important military security communications is also vital. The United States might also reconsider ratifying the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is a time for the United States to continue engaging in the Arctic. I'll conclude by saying that fixing the security void includes providing prevention and response services that Americans expect from their government, whether they live in Los Angeles, Houston, New York, or Utqiagvik, Alaska. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tingstedt, for your comments. Now I'd like to call Dr. Victoria Herman, who is the President and Managing Director of the Arctic Institute, for 5 minutes of comments. Dr. Herman is research focused on human development and resource economies. She was a fellow at the National Academies of Science and is a Fulbright Scholar. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon. As the President and Managing Director of a regional Arctic think tank, my research aims to identify the gaps in federal support to enhance Arctic security, to augment emergency response, and to assist coastal Arctic villages in adapting to the impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. However, I live in Washington, D.C., and therefore I cannot observe the day-to-day coastal and marine changes along Arctic coastlines that are the most immediate threat to our northern border. And so, when I was invited to this hearing, I reached out to colleagues in Alaska, from the Norton Sound to Bristol Bay, with a question: what is the most critical maritime security issue we should discuss here? Today, my testimony is guided by the many Indigenous and local Arctic experts I have listened to and learned from. If there is one takeaway message from their messages, it is this: for America's northernmost citizens, for the world's northernmost residents, climate change is already a life-threatening, everyday reality. The most recent NOAA Arctic Report Card delivered an unambiguous finding. The impacts of climate change are already forcing the region to undergo an unprecedented transition. Arctic air and sea temperatures are warming at more than twice the rate of the global average. The Arctic Ocean has lost 95% of its oldest documented sea ice. This new, more dangerous normal poses the greatest threat to human safety, to marine ecosystems, and to our capacity to respond to maritime emergencies. In September 2016, I first traveled to Nome, Alaska, a remote port city of 3,500 residents just south of the Arctic Circle. Through my research, I had the privilege of interviewing 20 local leaders to discuss how the settlement's infrastructure, population, and port are coping with the consequences of a changing climate. I believe that these interviews provide critical perspectives to support informed committee deliberations through 3 key findings. The first, Arctic coastal residents are the first responders to any maritime security threat. As Austin Amosuk, a lifelong Inupiat hunter and community advocate, noted in his interview, quote, "As we looked at how things like oil or hazardous spills are treated in this region, we came to a very dramatic realization. We are the first responders, and we have few response assets to ensure healthy environments. Annually, 14,000 to 18,000 gallons of spilled oil or hazardous substances occur in this region. We know our homelands and home waters, but over the last 2 years, we have not been able to speak at the table for our lands and waters," end quote. Disaster response and search and rescue capabilities are only as strong as the commitments to communication channels, technical commitments, and infrastructure investments to support collaboration with community first responders on our nation's Arctic coastlines. Better integrating and enhancing community-based observing networks as part of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, a DHS Center of Excellence, offers one opportunity to address this issue if it is done in a way that makes local leaders feel valued and included in upfront decision-making. 2, climate change is creating significant economic costs to U.S. coastal settlements and some local economic opportunity. However, at present, local economies are overburdened by costs and are unable to capture economic gains due to a lack of strategic investment in infrastructure. This is perhaps best grounded by lifelong Bristol Bay commercial fisherman Brett Verheusen. Quote, "The Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands are some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, contributing to American and the world's food security. Increased vessel traffic through the Arctic poses both opportunities and challenges for our fishing fleets. But those challenges can be devastating if we cannot respond quickly to emergencies and protect those fisheries." The third and final point, Arctic residents that act as first responders are living in a continual state of emergency from climate impacts. Coastal communities are facing threats to public safety, to food security, and traditional livelihoods from changing terrestrial and marine ecosystem conditions. Threats to human security in U.S. Arctic towns, villages, and cities must be integrated into investments and policy decisions for a secure northern homeland. Just this morning, a news headline read, "Summer 2019 was hellish for the Arctic, the front line of climate change." The Arctic has generated more crisis headlines like this than any other region. Nonetheless, in Mr. Amondsuk's words, we struggle mightily to have our voices heard. The hearing today is absent of many voices of community first responders and Indigenous knowledge holders. It is incumbent upon us here in Washington, D.C. to work harder to bring their voices to this table and to reach further to meet them at their tables above the Arctic Circle through field visits and hearings. As we work towards that goal of building a more inclusive dialogue on maritime security and economic investment in transportation, I urge us all to consider how we can ensure every Arctic conversation and legislation is guided by those local leaders and made with reference to the climate impacts already costing billions of dollars in damages, multiplying security threats, and devastating traditional maritime livelihoods, not only for the 4 million people that call the Arctic home, but for communities across America. Because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, it affects us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Herman, for your testimony. And our final witness is Mr. Lou Coffey, who is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Coffey served in the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense as Special Advisor to then Secretary of State for Defense, where he worked on Arctic security issues. He served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army and was awarded the Bronze Star. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for that introduction. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and distinguished members of the committee, I am honored to speak before this committee today about Arctic security issues. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I will summarize my prepared statement that has been submitted for the record.
Please.
Increased economic activity in the Arctic due to advancements in technology and reduced ice will likely lead to a larger military presence. This isn't because there's a heightened threat of conflict in the region, but many of the capabilities needed in the Arctic, such as search and rescue, are more immediately, and at least for now, more effectively provided by the military and the Coast Guard. Reduced ice in the summer months means new shipping lanes, increased tourism, further natural resource exploration, but these changes, in my opinion, will take time and should be put into perspective. For example, the Northern Sea Route that is often touted as a future rival to the Suez Canal has, interestingly, last year only 18 million tons of goods transited along that route. Of this, only 491,000 tons made the full journey from Europe to Asia. This is 0.04% of the volume of goods that transited through the Suez Canal during the same year. So far, the Trump administration has been a mixed bag when it comes to Arctic policy. On a positive note, Secretary Pompeo's visit to Iceland was the first cabinet-level visit to that country in more than a decade, and it ended the Obama administration's diplomatic sanctions on that country over the issue of whaling. Also, the administration recently announced the opening of a part-time diplomatic presence in Greenland, and this is something the Heritage Foundation has been calling for. However, there have been some shortcomings. The unwillingness of the U.S. to agree to a joint statement during the 2019 Arctic Council ministerial over the issue of climate change was unfortunate. And sometimes America's voice is missing in the debate. At last year's Arctic Circle Assembly in Iceland, U.S. government officials could not be seen. They certainly were not heard, and those of us that were there know that China happily filled this void. And I'm grateful that this year Secretary Perry will be giving the keynote address at that event. Mr. Chairman, today the U.S. has 4 primary security interests in the Arctic. Firstly, ensuring the territorial defense of the United States. In this sense, our relationship with Canada is vital. And relations with Iceland and Greenland are also important because these 2 countries are essentially the forward operating bases of the North American continent. Secondly, enforcing U.S. sovereignty in the region. In the Arctic, sovereignty equals security and stability. This means respecting the sovereignty of others while maintaining the ability to enforce one's own sovereignty. This will reduce the chances of armed conflict and ensure that tensions remain low in the region. Thirdly, meeting our treaty obligations in the Arctic through NATO. 5 of the world's 8 Arctic countries belong to NATO, but the alliance has no agreed policy on the region, and this needs to change. Finally, ensuring the free flow of shipping and other economic activities in the region. After all, economic freedom tends to lead to prosperity and security. Mr. Chairman, while the military threat in the Arctic remains low, U.S. policymakers cannot ignore Russia and China's role there. Both directly impact America's ability to meet its security interests in the region. Russia's recent steps to militarize the region is a concern. Russia has invested greatly in its Arctic footprint by building or refurbishing dozens of bases. The Arctic-based Northern Fleet accounts for 2/3 of the Russian Navy. An Arctic Command was established in 2015 to coordinate all Russian military activities in the region. Russia can do as it likes inside its own borders, but it is Moscow's actions in places like Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria that makes Russia's motives in the Arctic questionable. In the simplest terms, China sees its role in the Arctic as a place where it can expand its economic influence and diplomatic interests. But considering the problems China has created in places like Djibouti or Sri Lanka, there are reasons to be worried. Beijing's Arctic strategy offers a useful glimpse in how it wants the rest of the world to see the role of China in the region. Running 5,500 words long in the English language version, the strategy is littered with all the popular Arctic buzz phrases: common interests of all countries, law-based governance, climate change, sustainable development. The irony is not lost on observers of the South China Sea, where China has shunned international norms to exert dubious claims of sovereignty, or by the fact that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Even though China's closest point to the Arctic Circle is more than 800 nautical miles away, as you can see on the screen, Beijing refers to itself as a near-Arctic state, which is a term that it's completely made up. Extending Beijing's logic to other countries would mean that Kazakhstan, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Ireland are also near-Arctic states, and these aren't countries we normally associate with the Arctic. In conclusion, I want to highlight some of the challenges of operating militarily in the region. Equipment has to be hardened for extreme cold weather. High-frequency radio signals can be degraded due to magnetic and solar phenomena. GPS can be degraded due to poor satellite geometry. And some of Alaska's shipping lanes have not been surveyed properly since Captain James Cook sailed through in 1778. This is why proper investment in the region by the Coast Guard and the DoD is so important. This is not about preparing for war. This is about just preparing for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. And without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes of questions for the panel, and I would like to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Your testimony, to all of you, covered a great deal in terms of the challenges to our country and to our government in the Arctic, and I would ask, what do you see as the single biggest challenge facing the United States and the Coast Guard in the Arctic? If each one of you could answer that question.
Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, I will start because I know my colleagues will have many other items. But to me, it's this idea of domain awareness. If we don't have basic charting, as was pointed out, if we don't know the domain in which we're to operate, we simply can't do it efficiently. You can't build a port, you can't ship oil and gas, you can't develop an Arctic, you can't protect communities, you can't forecast what coastlines would look like unless we have fully charted the U.S. oceans, including the Arctic, around our region, especially in Alaska. And as was noted, those are lacking considerably. So I think that is one significant area of good hydrological surveys of our territory, because even if you have Coast Guard cutters and you want to put in ports, you still won't know what terrain you're dealing with unless you have basic data. So I would support the research related to hydrological charting and surveying.
Yes.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I would characterize the problem maybe according to a slightly larger scope, which is this issue of a potential security void, perceived or real, coming about because if the U.S. is not able to provide the prevention and response capabilities required in the Arctic as they are elsewhere across the United States. And I think that domain awareness is certainly a big part of that. So too are communications and response capabilities, to include the icebreakers, but I want to highlight that our research did find that it really takes a portfolio of capabilities. So although icebreakers are important, for example, and so too is charting, there are a suite of capabilities that the Coast Guard, for example, will need to operate effectively in the region. Thank you.
Dr. Herman?
I would add robust partnerships. As you, Chairman Correa, said in your opening remarks, the U.S. Coast Guard is forced to do more with less, and some of that could be augmented by providing more partnerships with scientific institutions to increase our charting, partnerships with those first responders in Alaska Native communities all along the coastlines, more partnerships in the international arena, as Mr. Coffey noted, about a lack of engagement.
So let me interrupt you. Statements were made that we have traditionally had good relations, cooperation with the Russians, two places, in space and in the Arctic. So do we concur that given that cooperation can become competition, that can become friction, because now you're just not talking about a frozen Iceland, you're talking about major resources. Do we see ourselves going in that direction?
I think we could if we don't provide robust partnerships. We have, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, since the fall of the Cold War, seen the Arctic as a peaceful region, and we have tried very hard through the Arctic Council to ensure that that has still been the case. However, when we don't invest in our allies through those partnerships in Scandinavia, if we don't invest in those partnerships with Canada—
Running out of time, let me have Mr. Coffey say a few words on that. Thank you very much, Dr. Herman.
I agree with the issue about situational awareness, so I have nothing to add in terms of what was already said, but I will say one thing about our lack of awareness of the fact that we are an Arctic country. Outside committee rooms like this, or certain offices and certain think tanks around town, there seems to be this inability to grasp the idea that we are an Arctic country, being so far away from it where we are.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now recognize a ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleperson from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question will be for Mr. Sfraga. Is that how you say your name? Thank you. And by the way, I read your testimonies, all of yours, and very interesting. Good job. Can you describe China's Polar Silk Road Initiative and its significance to the changing dynamic in the Arctic?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yeah, China plays the game of go, right? Big, long, strategic vision. Their Polar Silk Road, their shipping lanes, they see the Arctic like they see Africa. This is a region that they would like to have a lot of influence in. There's oil and gas, there's other critical minerals, there's rare earth minerals, and so there are a number of ways to influence a region, militarily, economically. Economically is where they're going, with a over $20 billion investment in the Yamal Peninsula. That's a way to influence the region. So China, in my perspective, is influencing the region and the Polar Silk Road as a resource area for them. It diversifies their energy portfolio. It allows them to influence the dialogue and what's happening in a region, even though they claim to be a near-Arctic nation. So this is long-term. They also are an observer to the Arctic Council, which means they get to speak at the Arctic Council when allowed to influence where they can the dialogue. Not all of it is nefarious, but nevertheless, this is long-term. So we might think in election cycles or in weeks or months or years. The Chinese think in decades. And so if a new ocean is opening, they're going to try every way they can to influence what happens there, governance-wise and also economically.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Coffey. Can you explain the significance of Russia's claim that the Northern Sea Route is an internal Russian waterway? How does that impact freedom of navigation concerns?
Russia's claim that the Northern Sea Route is part of its internal waterways is a very dubious claim that's based on a very loose interpretation of Article 234 of UNCLOS, which says that they can put certain restrictions on the navigation and transit in its EEZ due to environmental concerns and other issues. It is not, Russia's claim is not within the norms of international law. As far as I know, the only U.S. ally that has challenged this in terms of a freedom of navigation operation is France. It did so recently, and it transited the Northern Sea Route, a French supply ship, a French naval supply ship. And I think actually, under certain circumstances, when the time is right, the U.S. should also show that it does not recognize Russia's claim that this is an internal waterway and conduct freedom of navigation operations in the region.
Thank you. Interesting. Dr. Harriman, do you believe the United States needs to develop strategic ports in the Arctic?
I think that at present, the port infrastructure and wider infrastructure in port cities isn't built to reap the economic benefits of increased tourism in a sustainable way. We have not invested in that environmental sustainability, both through regulation to ensure that we're not polluting those critical fisheries to our food security and to Alaska fishermen, but we're also not investing in that infrastructure to ensure that when tourists come, that Alaska Native craftswomen and men are able to gain those economic benefits. So increased investment in port cities all across the Arctic, particularly Nome, but I think that that's a key thing that we need to do in the next 5 years.
And so, Dr. Harriman, just so I understand, are you saying that you're supporting it in the future, but not right now because we haven't built the infrastructure yet?
We have not built the infrastructure yet. I think that we need to, as I said in my statement, listen and learn from those who live in these port cities and be guided by those voices. So I think that, investing in those assets before making the large-scale investment in a port, making sure that those cities are well supported and are being led by local voices is the first step before any other major infrastructure investment is taken.
And thank you. I'm almost out of time, so I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I'd like to recognize Ms. Demings for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Unfortunately, our time is limited. They have called votes, but I'd like to ask this question, and whichever one of you feel best prepared, please answer. How would you describe the geopolitical tensions that currently are developing within the region, and what efforts do you believe U.S. allies are engaged in to really foster international cooperation?
Perhaps I could have the first stab at that. As I said, I believe that the level of geopolitical tension in the region is low, especially in a security or military sense. But as we've seen with Russia's actions in other places of the world, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, things could quickly change. And they seem to have the political will and a willingness to use military force to advance national interests, and I don't think cold weather is going to stop them. So I think we have to plan accordingly, assuming that Russia could act in a belligerent way in the region, especially considering that 5 of the Arctic countries, as I said, are in NATO, and the U.S. is obligated to defend Oslo, Norway, in the same way we're obligated to defend Orlando, Florida. So that needs to be factored into our way of thinking, I believe.
Thank you. Doctor?
Thanks for that question. So in our work on Arctic cooperation, we noted a long history of doing exactly that in the region, and there are many structures and frameworks in place to enable that. And so I don't want to overlook that in this discussion. But as has already been noted, our work also found that there were very few types of flashpoints or tensions that could arise in the near-term future, at least in the Arctic, because the stakeholders involved benefit from this cooperation economically and in other ways as well. But that said, I do think that one of the items that I mentioned in my testimony is this idea of a security void and nations being able to conduct their roles and responsibilities in the region as they would elsewhere in their territories. And I do think that that is something the U.S. needs to pay attention to moving forward in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Regretfully, I'm going to have to yield back, Mr. Chair, and
Now call Mr. Katko from New York.
Well, I don't regret that you finished early, because now I can ask questions and then go vote. So thank you for accommodating that. And thank you for having this hearing, because it's a really important issue. And one thing I love about Homeland Security, we're generally on the same page all the time, Democrats and Republicans, and this is another example of that. And so I'm just curious, as we're having this whole discussion here, I want to take a step back, because everything I've heard from everybody else I agree with, and we need to increase funding to Coast Guard and get a presence up there that's better and more sustained. But how did this happen? Can we venture an opinion as to how we let our guard down to this extent and allowed Russia to have so much more influence in that area? Why would we do that, especially with our involvement with NATO in those countries? Anybody want to hazard an opinion on that? Mr. Coffey, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think it goes back to the point I made about the lack of awareness of our role and status as an Arctic power in terms of the policy community and DoD and Department of Homeland Security, but also the inability to have a serious debate about this issue in our #1 security alliance, NATO. And this is because of an internal division between Norway and Canada over what role NATO should have in the region. To give you just one example, the NATO strategic concept, its most recent one, which highlights all the future challenges to the alliance, does not even mention the word Arctic once. Literally, it's not found. So that also feeds into our policymaking as well. So perhaps we are a little bit behind the curve because of it's our own fault.
Doctor.
I would agree with that. The U.S. is often called the reluctant Arctic nation, right? We are not at the table as often because we don't view ourselves as an Arctic nation. When you go to Moscow, when you speak with our Russian colleagues, right, they know that they are an Arctic nation. Our U.S. Special Representative to the Arctic, Admiral Papp, that has been an empty office for the past 2 years now. We do not promote ourselves as an Arctic nation. We are thousands of miles away from Alaska, and those voices just aren't heard in these halls. So in order to ensure that those conversations are happening at NATO, I think we first have to fully acknowledge and come to the table as an Arctic nation.
I mean, I know we're talking about the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard's presence and needs for it, but it's also a Department of Defense issue as well. And I'm just dumbfounded as to why we would let this happen. But anybody else want to add anything to that, Doc?
I would add just a few things. As an Alaskan, I have an interesting perspective, perhaps, in that the F-35s will be bedded down at Eielson Air Force Base here in just a little bit, and missile defense is almost exactly 100 miles from my driveway. So we are hypersensitive about what happens across the Bering Strait, what happens in the Indo-Pacific region. I think we have let our guard down as a country for a number of reasons. One, if you go back in history, you look at World War II, where it was reactionary. Alaska was at the spear of a lot of that happened in World War II, so we built an Alcan. We put in more forces there. Then the Cold War happened. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia played a great game under the ice. I mean, and above the air. Still today, we have Russian bombers that have come across and they're escorted out of from international waters. But at the end of the Cold War, there was a reset where we can sort of let our guard down and think about things. And then, of course, as a nation, we were looking elsewhere after 9/11. This now, climate change serves the fourth pillar of this, where we're seeing this ocean open before us. And
I'm going to interrupt you. We're running out of time, and I just want to thank the witnesses today for your comments. We're going to continue to address these issues, and I want to thank the members of the committee also for the questions, and you can add additional questions for the witnesses in writing, and we would ask you to respond to them as well. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Seeing no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Good luck getting to Morning. Welcome to Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security. This committee will now come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on the northern border Homeland Security Priorities in the Arctic, Part 2. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. I want to thank the ranking member Lesko and our panel of witnesses for joining us today. And I'm going to take the credit, but I'm going to give where credit is due. It's the Coast Guard that asked us to do this set of hearings on this issue months ago, and I think it's a good call. So thank you for bringing this issue to our attention. Today we'll discuss the U.S. Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic, following a productive hearing with non-government witnesses on this issue in September. We've seen the Arctic climate changing with diminishing ice openings and with maritime activity increasing in parts of the world that were essentially unnavigable and untouched in years before. It seems that we're ill-prepared for the changes brought about by a warmer climate in the Arctic. I'm very concerned about the number of aggressive actions of other nations in the region, especially China and Russia. We in the U.S., we've had a long history of supporting an internal rules-based order in order to foster a spirit of cooperation in the Arctic states. But in recent years, we've seen Russia expand its military installation in the area and expand its activities in the Arctic. They've invested heavily in assets to increase their maritime operations. Russia has the largest, or I should say, a large fleet of icebreakers that numbers more than 50 and more on the way. China, that's more than 1,000 miles away from the area, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing strategically in other Arctic nations to increase its presence and influence in the area. Russia and China's economic interests in the region rely heavily on opening up potential trade routes in the area as ice shelves continue to diminish. A new Northern Sea route would shorten the trip from East Asia to the Western Europe area by more than 13,000 miles. Such a route would allow China to ship goods to Europe in 2 weeks, faster, I should say, than it can do it today. Russia has begun to demand a fee from ships to travel through international waters along the Northern Sea route over which it claims ownership. Along with new and additional maritime activities, melted ice in the Arctic will increase economic activities such as tourism, fisheries, energy exploration, infrastructure development, as well as other areas presenting major challenges to the United States. And we must ensure development is sustainable with minimal environmental impacts and that it supports local communities, including the indigenous people. Presence of the Coast Guard, your presence in the Arctic and the State Department's diplomatic efforts to protect international cooperation will be critical to protecting our interests in the region. The Coast Guard's mission in the Arctic include regulation of shipping, fishing law, and ports of security, search and rescue, and support of scientific research. The Coast Guard is responsible for maintaining a U.S. presence in our territorial waters and defending our security and economic interests in the region. Right now, the Coast Guard is hampered by its Arctic mission because it only has 2 polar icebreakers, and only one of which is a heavy-duty icebreaker. Congress has provided funding in 2019 for the Coast Guard to begin construction of its first new polar security cutter, a good initial investment in improving the Coast Guard's capabilities. But the Coast Guard has started that six polar ice security but the Coast Guard has stated that 6 polar security cutters will be necessary to successfully execute its mission in the Arctic. And Congress must continue to emphasize its supporting efforts with the Coast Guard and your needs, as we will continue to value the Government Accountability Office assistance in ensuring appropriate oversight of these acquisition programs. In the meantime, the Coast Guard will need to use other resources and capabilities to meet its mission in the Arctic. The lack of adequate Coast Guard resources will make the State Department's diplomatic work all that more important. And unfortunately, just when American leadership and cooperation in the Arctic is needed on the international stage, we have chosen to eliminate the State Department's position of the Special Representative for the Arctic. I look forward to hearing from the State Department and how it's ensuring appropriate leadership in the Arctic issues despite the loss of that position. In my opinion, we need to invest more in our capabilities in the Arctic, not less, in order to ensure that the Coast Guard, the State Department, and its government partners can secure the homeland at our northernmost border. I look forward to our discussion today, and I will now recognize the Ranking Member Lesko of this subcommittee for an opening statement. Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have to say, I thought your opening statement was spot on, and we have bipartisan agreement, and this whole partisan culture that's going on, I welcome bipartisan agreement on an issue. And I also want to welcome a new member to our subcommittee, Representative Van Drew. Welcome. And,
Welcome, Master Van Drew. We do need another dentist in this committee.
There you go. Well, I'm pleased to see the subcommittee meeting today to gain additional perspectives on this important topic facing the United States national security. Our previous hearing on the Arctic gave the subcommittee valuable stakeholder perspectives on the homeland security implications of a changing strategic dynamic in the region, and I look forward to hearing today how the U.S. Coast Guard and State Department are responding. The many international legal, economic, scientific, and security challenges facing the Arctic present a complex set of issues that require close interagency collaboration and a united effort to work with our partners and present strength to our adversaries. I hope to hear today how the Coast Guard and State Department are working together to advance U.S. interests and what work is being done with our allies and partners. As we heard from our witnesses at the first hearing on this topic, the Arctic is quickly becoming a region in which commerce comes face to face with great power competition. The United States must work to protect its interest in international norms surrounding freedom of navigation. For this reason, I am eager to hear from our panel today about what resources are needed to accomplish a diverse and critical mission set and what additional implications for Homeland Security we can examine. The Coast Guard is the sole operator of America's polar-capable fleet, thus placing the service at a critical center of maintaining U.S. sovereignty in the Arctic. However, this reality also requires us to understand the Coast Guard's limitations related to an aging fleet consisting of a single heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, which, as we all know, suffers from age-related mechanical issues. I am pleased that Congress has finally funded a new polar security cutter and has begun funding for preparation of another. However, it is incumbent upon us to continue advocating for the resources and infrastructure needed by our men and women in uniform. As we ask more and more of the Coast Guard in the Arctic, we should be steadfast in our commitment to the service and its needs. And so I'm glad that we are in agreement on this issue, Mr. Chairman. The Homeland Security implications of a changing Arctic dynamic present both challenges and opportunities for the United States, and I am glad that the subcommittee is ensuring that we are part of the conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Admiral Charles Ray, is the Vice Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. Welcome you, sir, and I recognize you for 5 minutes of comments. You may begin.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, distinguished members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Admiral Schultz and all the women and men of the United States Coast Guard, I want to thank you for your unwavering support of our service. Arctic is growing increasingly important, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear today and discuss the Coast Guard's proactive strategy to advance U.S. national security interest in the region. I ask that my previous written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection, sir.
Thank you, sir. For over 150 years, your Coast Guard has been America's primary maritime presence in the Arctic, and the demand for our services is intensifying. As a result of the opening waters in America's northern coast, commercial opportunities range from fishing to energy production, rare mineral extraction, cruise operations, ecotourism abound. There's an overall increase in human activity in this region, and that indicates a need for increasing Coast Guard presence. Also, this combination of events has led to the opportunity for other nations, to seek to shape the security environment, expand their influence, and advance their own interest. As was stated by the chairman, Russia's got the world's largest icebreaker fleet by large. This ability to visible project force, coupled with the renewed interest in their infrastructure in the Arctic region and increase in military activities, are indicative of the strategic significance they place on the region. As was also stated, China, a non-Arctic state, not even within 900 miles, is also investing heavily in the Arctic. They're emblematic of their global influence campaign, whether from Africa to South America, anywhere on the planet you put it, they're doing the same, they're working from the same playbook. This year, China took delivery of its first domestically built icebreaker, Shuilong 2. They had the Shuilong 1, which they obtained from Ukraine and refitted, and so within about 2 years, they're going to surpass the United States in their icebreaker capability. If left unchecked, China and Russia's behavior risks fracturing the tenuous stability and rules-based governance in the Arctic. To address the nation's expanding national security needs and build on our 150 years experience, Coast Guard published an updated Arctic Strategic Outlook in April 2019, which reaffirms our commitment to promoting U.S. leadership in the region and preserving a peaceful, cooperative, rules-based region. As you all have stated, leadership begins with presence, and that's a challenge. Our nation's icebreaking fleet is aging, and we do not have the capacity to cover where we think we should be at the present time. But thanks to this subcommittee, the Congress, and the administration, we've turned the corner on that, and I'm really pleased that we've started on rebuilding our Polar Security Cutter fleet. Leadership in this region also requires operations in communities, ports, and waters, and we demonstrate this yearly through an operation called Arctic Shield. It's mobile, it's scalable, and we connect with the indigenous people of the region and participate in all of our other missions. As many nations aspire to expand their roles, the Coast Guard, we work collaboratively with these multilateral international organizations and working with the State Department and particularly with the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. And we participate in things that we can agree on, fisheries and pollution response and things like that. So that is a look in the right direction. However, to continue to protect our resources, we need other assets up there to improve communication, maritime domain awareness, navigation. I was up on the Cutter Healy north of the North Slope, about 60 miles, and for almost a month this past summer, they sailing up there, they were without any communications other than an HF radio. I mean, they were literally off the grid. That takes a whole of government approach, and I'm sure we'll be able to do that. In summary, a strong United States Coast Guard empowers the nation to lead in the Arctic and shaping the region as a safe, cooperative, and prosperous domain. I thank you for your support. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Without objection, your full statement will be inserted into the record. And I now recognize Mr. Michael Murphy, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, Department of State. Please summarize your comments in 5 minutes. Thank you. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lesko, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today to discuss the security situation in the Arctic. We are happy to work alongside our Coast Guard colleagues to deepen strategic partnerships in the region. Our goal is a secure and stable Arctic where U.S. interests are safeguarded, the U.S. homeland is protected, and Arctic states work cooperatively to address shared challenges. For more than 20 years, our principal focus in the Arctic has been on promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among Arctic states and communities on issues such as sustainable development and environmental protection. Much of this work has occurred through the Arctic Council. And as Secretary Pompeo has underscored, the Arctic Council's work is an important part of our agenda. At the same time, we must adjust our Arctic policy to today's new strategic reality, which is characterized by the return of great power competition, a change driven by the desire of Russia and the People's Republic of China to challenge the United States and the West. The Arctic is not immune from these implications. In fact, we should expect the rapidly changing Arctic system to create greater incentives for Russia and the PRC to pursue Arctic agendas that clash with our interests. Russia views the development of the Arctic region as critical to its economic future, and Russia has legitimate Arctic interests. Within the Arctic Council, Russia has cooperated with the United States on issues including oil spill response and search and rescue. However, Russia's restrictions on the freedom of navigation in the Northern Sea route are inconsistent with international law. At the same time, Russia's military presence in the Arctic is growing. In recent years, Russia has established a new Arctic command, created 4 new Arctic brigades, refurbished old airfields and other infrastructure in the Arctic, and established new military bases along its Arctic coastline. It has also made a concerted effort to establish a network of air defense and coastal missile systems, early warning radars, rescue centers, and a variety of centers in the Arctic. The Russian military buildup in the Arctic has implications beyond its waters. From a geostrategic perspective, the Arctic and the North Atlantic are inextricably linked. The Arctic provides Russian ships and submarines with access to a critical naval choke point, the GI-UK gap, that plays an outsized role in NATO's defense and deterrence strategy. Underwater transatlantic cables also run through this area. In short, NATO's northern flank must once again command the attention of the United States and its allies. The PRC presents a different challenge. Its stated interests in the Arctic are primarily focused on access to natural resources and the opportunities offered by Arctic shipping routes. In 2018, the PRC outlined its plans to develop a polar Silk Road as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It declared itself a near-Arctic state and signaled an intention to play a role in Arctic governance. This is disconcerting given PRC behavior outside the Arctic, where it often disregards international norms. The PRC is seeking greater influence in the Arctic by trying to grow its economic, diplomatic, and scientific presence. Over the past several years, the PRC has secured mining licenses for mineral deposits throughout the region, including uranium and other rare earth minerals. In 2019, it launched its first home-built icebreaker. The PRC is maintaining research stations in Iceland and Norway, and it operates 23 Confucius Institutes in Arctic countries outside of Russia and the United States. But as we've seen across the globe, soft power tools have a sharp edge when deployed by the PRC. The PRC has weaponized its state capitalism in an effort to secure control of critical dual-use infrastructure. The PRC has demonstrated a willingness to use coercion, influence operations, and other methods to get what it wants. This pattern of behavior, particularly the way the PRC has used development of critical infrastructure to establish a permanent security presence, must inform our approach on the PRC's interests and activities in the Arctic. Security challenges exist in the Arctic, but the region is also full of opportunity. It is home to fish stocks critical to global food supply, and deposits of minerals essential to the production of advanced technology. As navigation seasons opened in the Arctic Ocean, new, faster, cheaper circumpolar navigation and shipping routes may emerge. The Department of State will work to ensure that this region remains open to shared economic and scientific interests, and our security interests are protected. More broadly, we want the United States to be a partner of choice in the Arctic. We plan to increase our engagement with and investment in the region. We are working to establish a diplomatic presence in Greenland this summer. We have proposed a new $12.1 million funding package to jumpstart our engagement in Greenland. We are also exploring the possibility of increasing the footprint of U.S. Embassy Reykjavik. As a department, we continue to support programs designed to increase the resilience of Arctic communities to malign actors, and we are continuing the good work and strong cooperation of the Arctic Council. Its work on non-security issues makes a vital contribution to Arctic security. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lesko, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to meet with you today and to discuss the challenges and opportunities we face in the Arctic. I look forward to your continued cooperation and your questions.
Mr. Murphy, thank you very much. And without objection, your record will also be inserted into the record. And Ms. Marie Mack, our next witness, is the Director of Contracting and National Security Acquisitions at the GAO. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss Coast Guard's role in the Arctic and some key challenges it faces in the region. As in all U.S. waters, the Coast Guard is responsible for maritime safety, security, environmental protection, and national defense, among other missions in the Arctic. As the ice continues to recede and human activity increases, the Coast Guard has faced and will continue to face expanding responsibilities in the region. Although ensuring the safety and security of this dynamic region requires a whole-of-government approach, the Coast Guard's capabilities and capacities are also vital to ensure national security. It is with the icebreakers that the U.S. can have the assured access to the polar regions as well as to safeguard our national interests. With that said, the three areas that I would like to highlight today are: first, the capability gaps the Coast Guard identified in the region; second, the current Coast Guard icebreaker capacity in the polar regions; and third, the key risk facing the Coast Guard's acquisition of the new polar security cutters. Specifically, with respect to capability, we found back in 2016 that the Coast Guard identified various gaps in the region which are still valid today. These include, but they're not limited to, communications, infrastructure, and icebreaking. The Coast Guard has worked to mitigate these gaps with its Arctic partners, but we found during our review that the Coast Guard does not systematically assess how the actions it takes in that area will affect those capability gaps. We made a recommendation to do so, Coast Guard agreed, and since then has been developing an implementation plan which will provide the foundation for assessments of those capability gaps. Second, when it comes to polar icebreaking capacity, the Coast Guard currently only has two operational polar icebreakers, one medium, the Healy, and one heavy, the Polar Star. The Healy, commissioned in 2000, primarily supports Arctic research, but it cannot ensure timely access year-round. The Polar Star, commissioned in 1976, and the only U.S. heavy icebreaker that can break at least 6 feet of ice continuously, is in dire condition, and it's limited to conducting an annual mission to resupply the McMurdo Station in Antarctica. The last two missions, the crew had admirably dealt with flooding and fires and creative ways to replace broken parts. Third, as the Coast Guard continues its effort to address the ice-breaking capability and capacity gaps through the acquisition of the Polar Security Cutter, it is important to recognize that the U.S. has not built an icebreaker of this kind in over 40 years. And as we have found time and time again in our shipbuilding and major defense acquisition work, programs, though well-intentioned, are incentivized and pressured to move forward before they've gained sufficient knowledge at various points throughout the acquisition process. In other words, not having a solid business case. As we found in 2018, the Polar Security Cutter program did not start off with a sound business case either. However, in response to our recommendations, the Coast Guard has signaled a commitment to gaining key knowledge before proceeding. For example, the program assessed its key technologies and is planning to revise the schedule to be more realistic. This program is still early in its life cycle. A key milestone and test of the Coast Guard's commitment to a sound business case will be the start of construction on the lead ship, which is slated to begin next year. In conclusion, the Arctic region has increased in strategic importance in recent years. As more nations look to the Arctic for both economic and geopolitical advantages, the demand for the Coast Guard presence will continue to grow. Both the Coast Guard and Congress should remain vigilant in ensuring that the program attains key knowledge on the ship's design before authorizing construction on the lead ship. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mack, and I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. And now I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. First question to all of you. Listening to your testimony, I'm trying to figure out where we start. It's such a huge issue with so many parts. So for each witness, I would ask, what do you see as the single biggest challenge facing the United States, and in particular the Coast Guard, in your role in the Arctic? Admiral Ray.
Sir, Mr. Chairman, I think, as was stated by Ms. Mack, we were a long time in coming, over 40 years in building a polar security cutter or heavy icebreaker. And so now that we've gotten started, we got to get it right. And meanwhile, Polar Star, as was stated, our current icebreaker, she right now is at McMurdo Station in the South Pole as we sit here today. And she successfully broke it out. By breaking out, I mean they opened up the channel where they could get the resupply vessels in. And so she's doing her job. We've got a plan to extend her service life. We'll start work on that so when she comes home in our summertime, their wintertime down in the South Pole, we'll spend extra time in the yard, extra funds to extend her service life. And so we've got to keep her in service until this new polar security cutter that Ms. Mack was talking about comes out of the yards, which is projected in '24. So that overlap time between now and then is critical time. We've got to maintain this aging ship and get the new ship going while being mindful of all the challenges of the first ship of a class coming off the way.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy.
I would just echo what the Admiral said about presence equaling influence and leadership. And certainly the State Department shares the view that a greater Coast Guard presence in the Arctic would be a positive thing in terms of shaping the strategic environment in the United States' favor. With regards to the State Department itself, there is a change going on in the Bureau of European Affairs where 7 of the Arctic states, or 6 of the 7 Arctic states in the Arctic Council are located. We have a new strategic environment with regards to the challenges we're seeing from China and Russia. And in the past, before the acknowledgement of the great power competition paradigm, which we now find ourselves in, we saw Europe primarily as a platform for partnerships outside the region. We are now in a theater of operations ourselves in much the same way that other parts of the world have been, prior to this. So the United States State Department, the Bureau of European Affairs, needs to make that transition from a platform for operations outside the continent, whether in the Arctic or elsewhere, to what I'll call a warfighting command, in much the same way that EUCOM is doing in response to the challenges we're seeing from Russia and China. And that's one of the reasons we're working on presence in the Arctic region itself.
Ms. Mack.
Both the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard Arctic strategies have highlighted some of the same capability gaps that I mentioned earlier, like communications, maritime domain awareness, infrastructure, ice-breaking, and training opportunities. So in order to really figure out what the top priorities for the U.S. should be, there needs to be a whole-of-government approach to determine which priorities in these gaps are the most urgent and how to proactively address them to address all these gaps, which one is most important to address first. But it's important that we tend to be more reactive. It's really important as a government that we be proactive. By the time the threats are imminent in this region, it'll be too late.
So we're kind of chasing the issues as opposed to planning long-term in anticipation of developments. Yes? Thank you very much. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time and ask Ms. Lesko to engage for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to both Admiral Ray and Mr. Murphy, and it's just a kind of a basic question. There's so many needs throughout the world and to protect us. Do you think this concern about the Arctic and competition in the Arctic and making sure that we have a presence in the Arctic has risen high enough to the level to get the attention of top people as a priority?
Well, I think it's certainly it's not been, but recently that we've received the attention of subcommittees such as this one in the Congress and the people who have the opportunity to provide the resources to do what we need to do to have that presence that Mr. Murphy's talking about. So, and I think likewise within the administration, we've got great support for the Polar Security Cutter program, incredible support. And so right now, I think this has reached the highest levels of government. In the Coast Guard, we've been talking about this for, I don't know, a decade at least. And it was seen before as kind of Alaska problem. I don't see that as the situation anymore. Yeah. I see this as everybody understands it's a national priority, and both from the Congress and from the administration, we've got the support we need. It's just, we've got there's additional things besides Polar Security Cutters that we need to get after. As Ms. Mack talked about, there's communication and other capabilities, and we can discuss those as you see. But I think generally speaking, this has gotten the attention now that we needed to have.
And I would agree. When I started my job about 2 years ago, Arctic security and the Arctic really wasn't on my agenda at all. It was a traditional Nordic, Baltic, European security portfolio. That change has come about directly as a result of the Secretary putting it on our agenda and making clear that we in the Bureau of European Affairs need to focus on the Arctic security piece of what's happening, not just the Arctic Council type issues that we focused on in the past, important as though they are. And the work that we're doing now to put a permanent presence in Greenland, a new consulate there, and we're looking at, as I said in my remarks, expanding our presence in U.S. Embassy Reykjavik. That I'm working directly with the counselor who's been directed by the Secretary of State to make sure this happens. And so I've seen a big change in both support at the top and in the energy behind these issues in my 18 months in the State Department in my current job.
Yeah, it's good to hear. It's good to hear. Another question for Admiral Ray is Ms. Mack talked about in her testimony how, the Coast Guard had problems tracking and measuring progress in the Arctic region, and she said that the Coast Guard has agreed to the recommendations. So can you expand upon that? Like what has the Coast Guard been doing, not only on that, but she also said like a business plan to purchase and acquire the Coast Guard cutters?
Yes, ma'am. Well, I think there's been a combination of events that have allowed us to put forth a persuasive argument that this is a national problem, that we need to operate there, and that we are not, the resources that we had appropriated to this mission were insufficient for what the nation needed to do. Mm-hmm. And so I've worked with Ms. Mack over the last few years. What they do is kind of help us look at our plans moving forward, whether it's the acquisition of the National Security Cutter. And that's a tough thing to do. It's a specialized construction. And so what we did is, largely, according to their advice, we partnered with the Navy in order to have an integrated program office. So the specialized shipboard constructions is really not that different than building a submarine, which is a specialized construction. So we had Navy leadership that has experience in that working with us throughout the way. She also talked about our, not really understanding the state of the art with regards to technology. So we did industry studies, which we paid for industry to analyze this problem before we put out the request for proposal. And that really made a big difference. It really narrowed us down with regards to technology that we would use, different than what Polar Star has now with regards to what's available on the market, kind of the state of the market. So I think we've been specifically following their guidance on this. And then the whole process of the acquisition, that requires attention. With regards to the other capabilities, Ms. Mack's exactly right. I mean, it's difficult to communicate. When you get north of the North Slope up in Alaska or north of that same latitude in Greenland or anywhere, it is difficult. It's difficult to navigate. It's difficult to do everything that you do down here. And that's why this presence and being there in the interim, you don't just show up in the Arctic and decide to operate there. You need to be working on it every day. And we've been about that through an operation called Arctic Shield that we've been doing for the last several years. So I think we've been not 100% with what GEO would have us to do, but we've been working down that path.
Well, that's wonderful, and I want to thank all of you for working on this important issue, and I agree with Chairman Correa. We need to continue to support our efforts up there, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I recognize Ms. Barragan for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel for being here today. Thank you, Admiral, for your work and that of the Coast Guard. I represent the Port of Los Angeles, and you are very, the work that you all do there, the men and the women, is remarkable. So I want to thank the Coast Guard for its work. We were handed out this little chart here that shows the icebreakers of the world, and it's pretty remarkable to see Russia at 53, plus 600 construction and 12 planned, and the U.S. only at 5. That's more than 10 times as many. That's quite remarkable. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about what that means, but before I get to that, Admiral, does the Coast Guard believe in climate change? Do they take a position on it?
What we've stated pretty consistently over the years is we remain pretty agnostic about it. What we know is there's water where there used to be ice, and we have a job to do there. And so that's how we go about that.
So the Coast Guard's 2013 Arctic strategy attributed decreases in sea ice coverage explicitly to climate change. However, the 2019 Arctic strategy avoided such an attribution and merely acknowledged a changing climate. As the Coast Guard plans for its future needs over the coming years and decades, it must use the best scientific estimates for what the climate and sea levels will look like. How does the Coast Guard incorporate scientific models and projections into its planning activities? And are the Coast Guard's projections for future needs driven by scientific consensus or politics?
Well, we base it on science, and thanks to the support from this committee and others. In fact, what we've seen, as I know you're aware of, the hurricane supplemental money we've received from the 3 years of storms we had down south along the Gulf and in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And so what we're doing is we're building our stations back with an acknowledgement that in the future, the ocean conditions and the coastal conditions are going to be different than they are now. And so we've got to build back in a more resilient type infrastructure. So we are, I think, clearly acknowledging that it's a changing environment and we need to be able to operate in it. And we don't have the luxury of not being close to the coast because that's where our business is. And so we're building back more resilient facilities.
So you mentioned the ice is melting. Is there any other environmental changes that have occurred in the Arctic? And what type of changes do you project for the future in the Arctic?
Yes, ma'am. There are multiple things that are changing. One of the things I talked to the chairman about the other day is the fish stocks are, we've got indications from working with NOAA that fish stocks are migrating further north as there's a slight warming in the Bering Sea. The fish stocks are moving north, and so the Bering Sea is a really important fishery to the nation. Probably better than 50% of the nation's, seafood products that we consume come from the Bering Sea. And so those fish stocks migrating north, that's a
Can you repeat that again, that statement you just mentioned?
Yes, sir. About 52% of the seafood products that America consumes, sells, that we harvest from the ocean come from the Bering Sea, which is just south of the Arctic Circle. The biggest part of it is. And I've been up there, quite a bit, operated up there, and that's a well-managed fishery. There's a lot of cooperation. There's a very defined border between us and the Russians, so it's a well-managed fishery. And then as those fish stocks migrate north, those that would take advantage of a less well-defined structure, they will do that. And so we have to be mindful of that. So fish stocks moving north, There are changes, if you talk to the indigenous people, which I have many times, there are changes to the migration patterns of marine mammals that they depend on for subsistence living. They go further offshore to look for whales, and I could go on, but suffice it to say there's changes. And then equally, with regards to the environment, there are changes to the permafrost that they depend on, they've built on, and that has been frozen for eons. And as that has, as it's changed, then you got to watch some of the infrastructure that they've got in those native villages up there. So that's the summary of the changes I'm aware of, ma'am.
Great, well, thank you. I'm definitely concerned with climate change and what it's doing to the region and the impact it's going to have on national security. With the time remaining left, if you take a look at the chart, as I mentioned, there's a pretty remarkable difference between the icebreakers that Russia has and China has. Should the U.S. Be concerned that it's lagging so far behind Russia and China? Maybe one of the other panelists want to start.
I won't speak to Coast Guard specific points, but yes is the short answer to the question. One of the reasons the State Department is working to enhance its presence in the region and diplomatic engagement is precisely because we see our adversaries doing the same. And we have to move beyond a point where we're focused solely on the one element of Arctic policy that we've been focused on over the past 20 years, as important as it is, the work of the Arctic Council, to ensuring we inject a respect for and concern about Arctic security into what we do every day. And that's precisely what the Secretary has asked us to do, and that's what lay behind, for example, our decision to open a new consulate in Greenland.
Admiral, do you want to chime in before I yield back?
Well, I think what we propose in the Coast Guard is 631. So I think trying to catch the 53 is not something that we think is that aspirational for us. Talk about 6 icebreakers total. We need to do the job. We need to do at both poles. 3 of them need to be heavy icebreakers, and we need the first one right now, as we've talked about. And so and we'll reassess that as we move forward, but the critical thing is to get that first one off the ways at the shipyard.
Thank you, Ms. Vodega. Now I recognize Mr. Katko for 5 minutes of questions, sir.
Mr. Chairman, is this on? Yeah, the light's on. There you go. First of all, I never want to miss an opportunity to tip my hat to the Coast Guard. I've worked with you for 20 years when I was in Puerto Rico and back in upstate New York and around the world. And you do a remarkable job, and you have to wear many hats. And from the law enforcement and organized crime standpoint, you do an awesome job. And I just want to thank you and all the men and women who work under you for the great job that they do. So thank you for that. And I'm absolutely convinced that we obviously need to plus up the forces up and the icebreakers and the ships. And I agree with you, Admiral, we can't get to where Russia is, and nor do I think we need to be effective. And I think my colleagues have pointed that out pretty well as well. But I want to take a step back and understand from a bigger picture standpoint. Maybe we can start with Mr. Murphy on this issue, and that is, I want to understand the interplay with Russia better and China and the U.S. As I understand it, Russia does have somewhat of a decent working relationship to some extent with the U.S. on this issue. China seems to be trying to elbow their way in. So what do you see as the issues going forward, if you can summarize them for us as best you can, in the interplay between all three, and what are the real threats?
Sure. You're right. Russia does have a good working relationship with the United States and the other Arctic states within the Arctic Council. And we've done some great work on search and rescue, good scientific collaboration, responses to oil spills, things of that nature, and that's been positive. And we want to make sure we don't lose that. There's no reason to want to lose that. The Russian challenge is, of course, the military buildup that's not just occurring, of course, in the Arctic. This is all related. It's occurring in the East, and sort of the Russian behavior in Europe more broadly in terms of violating international rules and norms, the actions it's taken in the Donbass and in Crimea and Georgia. I mean, we have seen that Russia can flip a switch and go from to a military, take a military approach to pursuing its interests if it wishes to. And we need to respond as allies and in the United States within NATO to the challenges that the Russians are now posing to us in the Arctic and the North Atlantic militarily. With regards to China, it's a bit different, of course. They have not established a military presence in the Arctic, but they are very aggressively pursuing economic and other interests in the Arctic in ways that are disconcerting, given some of the claims that they're making about where they want to be involved in Arctic governance as a near-Arctic state.
Near-Arctic state, yeah,
which is malarkey, of course. There's no such thing as a near-Arctic state. There are Arctic states and non-Arctic states, and China is the latter, not the former. And the Arctic Council works fine, thank you very much, without China. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that what looks relatively benign on the surface, an economic investment here, a piece of scientific cooperation there, may have long-term military purposes. And we know from reading some of the journals, the scholarly journals, that the Chinese have been quite clear about their intentions there. And we need to begin countering that influence now. We don't want to wait and wake up and find someday that we've lost control of a port somewhere or an airfield somewhere that we need for our own security and defense, or that we need to protect and defend our allies. And those are the challenges.
So thank you. It's a great summary, and it was very helpful. Just a couple follow-up questions, and one observation, then one question. The observation is China's got the money to do the build-up. I question whether Russia has the ability to sustain itself, given the fact that oil is remaining at a low price on the international market, and their economy is not as strong as it once was, and maybe never was. And just how much money can they dedicate to this constant buildup that they're contemplating?
The challenge is one of near-term and long-term, if I'm going to really shorthand it. As we've seen from Russian behavior right across, not just in Europe or in the Arctic, but in the Middle East and in South America and in Africa, they have the resources to be very aggressive and to challenge our interests where they want to, when they want to, despite the challenges you allude to facing their economy and their long-term prognosis of their economy. So we can't wait and hope that history is going to bend into a particular direction. We have to help shape the forces, in our own favor, and that's one of the reasons I think we still need to continue to pay attention to Russia and push back where it's necessary.
This is very helpful. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katko, and I recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being very new in Congress and listening to this, even if you didn't have anything about climate change and new routes in the Arctic and increased global great power competition, as you put it, Mr. Murphy, it would be easy for me to see that the need for a heavy icebreaker, if you had got one and it's flooding and burning as it's in its exercise and its mission, has got to be replaced. I get that. That seems to be largely what we're talking about, at least in the immediate future. I understand there's a plan that goes farther out. I understand, Mr. Murphy, that you're talking about responding to the challenges by having a new consulate in Greenland. But when you describe the phenomenon and characterize it as great power competition, same sort of phenomenon we're seeing in the South China Sea and so forth, those responses sound to me, just as a matter of common sense, a little inadequate. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe that I think we have the means to project American power in a much bigger way, because that consumes a tremendous amount of resources. But I do wonder about that. Could you, Mr. Murphy, maybe first, and then Admiral Ray, if you would, address that apparent mismatch between what's being suggested as the response and the nature of the dynamic that you're describing?
I think, we have to look at this as something that doesn't happen in a week or a month. It takes time. We went through pivot points in our strategic, in the past in strategy, in 1945, 1989, and 2001, and it took time to get from where we wanted to be, from where we were to where we wanted to be. I mean, Germany didn't join NATO until 1953. It didn't come out of whole cloth in 1945 at the end of the war. And I think what you're seeing is the United States government and the legislative and the executive branch making adjustments to this new strategic reality. So I would argue that the consulate in Greenland is an example of that, but it's not all that we're doing. The Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs in my department and the Bureau of Energy Affairs are vigorously involved in dealing with the threats posed by 5G networks coming from China, for example. We've been very forceful in pushing back against unfair Chinese trade practices, for example. It's not just, when you talk about it in the context of the Arctic, it's in part about presence now, because we haven't been as present as we need to be. So it's just one piece of the puzzle. I wouldn't characterize it as the whole.
That's helpful. And Admiral Ray, maybe I think what we're seeing here is a glimpse of a piece, given this committee's jurisdiction, of the response to that new dynamic. Can you characterize how it is that, for the immediate near future, one new heavy cutter in relationship, to Russia's assets that have been described, how that materially changes the way America has a presence in the region?
Yes, sir. It's really pretty, what our strategy and the number, that 6 that I talked about earlier, the first one being important, is it allows us to be present there. And so we've got, the Department of Defense has great assets that protect us under the ocean and in the skies, and greatest in the world. But you got to have an on-surface presence to contest these folks. We can talk about it in a different setting, exactly what's happened in the past where they've just kind of pushed the envelope. And if you're not there to stand up to them, to kind of say, hey, what are you doing? That becomes a challenge. So really, what happens when you build a heavy icebreaker, that allows you to be up there anywhere you want to be in the Arctic pretty much year round. There's certain times it'll be a little too bad, but you can be there anytime. Do we need to be there this winter? Probably not. But if you look at the way it's trending, and we need to have the capability to operate up there all year round. And that's what these will do for us.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Murphy, one other question, I think. So can you characterize maybe what's the interagency partnership look like across the government to respond to the Arctic situation in the Arctic, and which agency spearheads it? Is it state?
It depends on the issue, of course. But in general, the department leads, for example, the Department of State leads in preparing and managing the relationships that occur within the Arctic Council, which brings together a whole slew of agencies, including the Coast Guard, with whom we partner greatly and coordinate greatly in the work that they're doing in the Arctic Council working groups on things like search and rescue and oil spills and whatnot. We work very closely with the National Science Foundation and NOAA, which are also involved in the Arctic Council work. My team and my office work very closely with the Pentagon, the civilian side and the military side, to deal with the challenges in the Arctic as they look through the lens of NATO, which is one of my areas of responsibility. The interagency has been pulled together several times, many times, by the National Security Council to discuss how we respond to and what we do in the context of the new challenge in terms of Arctic security. So it's myriad and multifaceted. And what's interesting, and I say this as someone who's been learning about this myself over the last 8-9 months, is there are a lot of strands here. But what I'm consistently impressed with is the dedication and the commitment of the people with whom I work right across the interagency process to getting this right for the United States, which is what I think they get up every morning and try to do.
No doubt. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Bishop, and I recognize Mr. Vandrew for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for the work that you do. Particularly, I've had a relationship with the Coast Guard as well, and wanted to echo Congressman Katko's words. As you know, we have the training center for the entire United States in Cape May in my district, actually only a few minutes from my house. So we really do appreciate the work that you do. I'm going to ask an elemental question, a basic question. You know, they say there's no such thing as a stupid question, so here we go. How is this governed? In other words, how does this operate? Like, what gives China the right to just be up there, or Russia, or us? How does this whole system work? Mr. Murphy, I guess I would start with you on that.
That's fair enough. Obviously, within the context of the Arctic Council, which is the principal forum for the Arctic states to address.
Which is made up of those states that
That's
are
right,
up there.
the Arctic
right?
states, exactly right. There are 8 of them. Canada, the United States, of course, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, and Russia. And that by design, the remit of the Council is not on security issues. It's focused on things like environmental protection, search and rescue, scientific research. And it's deliberately designed that way when it was inaugurated in 1996. And they've been engaged in partnerships across the board on those types of issues, and they sort of set the rules, if I can put it that way. That's probably, the lawyers would probably tell me that's too strong a word, but they more or less set the rules for Arctic governance. Now, they don't have the ability to enforce those rules. It's up to the individual member states of the Arctic Council themselves, which has happened. And that partnership occurs also with indigenous peoples and indigenous groups across the Arctic states and non-indigenous Arctic communities that are living in the Arctic.
So it's a little complicated.
It is a little complicated, but it works. The most important thing to remember is it works. It has, for 20 years, it has produced results.
So let me ask this question. I just like exactly how it happens. So China of late has been more involved, correct?
They've been more assertive in pushing their presence into the
To
Arctic.
whom did they have to go to get permission to do that?
They don't have to ask, for example, to seek investments in critical infrastructure in Finland or Norway.
But the group that is there, that council, agreed that they could be there.
Every nation has the right to seek investments in, foreign countries. What we need to do as the governments of the Arctic states ourselves is make sure that we are looking at those and asking ourselves, are we screening them? Should we allow control of a port or an airport to fall to the Chinese? Should we allow them to obtain controlling stakes in sensitive minerals and mining areas? And that's on us. And one of the things the Department of State has been doing with others in the interagency is pressing not just these states, but countries worldwide to put in place exactly these kinds of investment screening mechanisms, for example. Do we want them to control information technology and 5G networks where they might use for nefarious purposes? So we're pressing in those areas.
Each person has one vote?
In the council, yes. It's a consensus-based organization. So they're not... we have to distinguish between the individual projects the member states agree to take up and the working groups that they're engaged in, and then the broader set of challenges. China can sail in international waters, and I'm really going to defer to the Coast Guard in this just as we can. What we want it to do is to respect the rules-based order and be transparent in the way that it goes about, asserting its being present or engaging in economic...
A little bit more than most modern governments, interactions in cities. It seems a little bit more of I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but Wild West type of atmosphere compared to what you see in most of the world, or at least a good part of the world. It seems like an open territory where people can kind of go in and to some degree do what they want.
I think because the Arctic is changing, there are opportunities opening up that weren't there before in terms of shipping and other places that create these potential challenges you're alluding to. Yes.
That they're in the future because of that, and then I'll just wrap up. But two things. One, I agree with you, absolutely. It's unbelievable. We need these Coast Guard cutters for sure. We need to make sure that we have this equipment. Secondly, I think it's important probably as we go forward that the scrutiny might be greater because of what's going on and the changes that are occurring on our Earth. Thirdly, I do think that there are climate changes that are occurring, but regardless of the climate changes, we have a responsibility as far as the resources that are up there, and we have a responsibility as far as safety and governance to ensure that we have our rightful role of having some control over what's going on in the future. Because, the one thing we can talk about climate change all we want, whatever you believe and whatever's going to happen, it's not going to be cured like that. So this process, to some degree, is going to go on, and we have to be able to control it. And I think that's what you're trying to say. And I think you're absolutely right.
I think a secure and stable Arctic, where our U.S. interests are safeguarded, where our homeland is protected, and where Arctic states work cooperatively on some of these challenges is exactly what we're aiming for, and it's irrespective of any other sort of issue going on
Last question on this. What's the time frame? I know Russia's been involved a long time, but for China, what's the time frame where they've really gotten active there?
It goes back several years, 3 or 4 years at least.
So this is a relatively new activity on their part.
I think the administration's national security strategy does an outstanding job highlighting this geostrategic shift that has occurred in the world. I think it was happening before 2014 with regards to Russia, for example, before a 2016 attempt by the Chinese to make a purchase in Greenland of what was a formal naval base of the United States. but it crystallized everyone's thinking. It's the new frame. And I see, strong bipartisan support in my job from this body, but also outside in think tanks in the NGO community for moving forward to put in place the tools that we need to succeed in that frame and protect our interests and our security and ensure the prosperity for the American people as we did for the last 75 years.
Absolutely. I think we have to keep an eye on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew. I'd like to move into a second round of questions if we can. And I wanted to start out by asking Admiral Ray, without getting into political issues of global warming, I would ask specifically, I presume the Coast Guard has a plan, has some projections in terms of what assets will be needed in that area of the world based on less ice in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yes, sir. We've talked a lot about the polar security cutters, but there are other assets that we'll need to operate up there as well.
And so coming back to that chart Ms. Berrigan put up, and it shows that we're way behind when it comes to icebreakers when you compare us to the Russians, some of the others. But there's other ways to multiply, so to speak, our assets to make sure that we have other non-icebreaker capabilities to assure that we have some kind of a semblance of control and enforcing rule of law in that area?
Yes, sir. As was stated previously, the ability to communicate up there requires use of new technology. We did an did a test starting 2 years ago with small satellites that were launched from SpaceX in a low Earth polar orbit to allow us to communicate. And this was, pretty funded by DHS, S&T, and we learned a lot during that. It wasn't intended to become operational. We learned a lot. So that's an example of things that we need to do to get into that line of business. There are things we need to do with our aviation assets that we need to operate up there. But I think the most important thing that we've kind of believe is the secret to the Coast Guard's ability to be agile, because you can't cover the whole thing from fixed basis, is to have these movable resources that you can, because in 2015, it was all about shale drilling for oil. And we were all stationed over in what I'll call northwest of Utqiagvik. More recently, the eco-tourist traffic is further to the east, and when I say further east, several hundred miles. So we got to be agile and able to move around.
And Mr. Murphy, you made a statement that the administration now understands the importance strategically of this area to our nation. But I would say, just from a gut reaction here, I would say that we as a nation do not appreciate the importance of this region to our country. And I say that to you because unless you're in the front page of the newspapers every day, unless you begin, really push this in front of the public, our policymakers are probably not going to look at this. This committee is the second hearing we've had on this issue, and we're trying to push this information out to the rest of our colleagues. And it's important because long-term, pennies invested today will save us a lot of headaches and a lot of dollars in the future. We talked earlier, Admiral, about the fish stock in the Bering Sea. 52% of our fish and a huge percentage of our protein coming from that area. You talked about the fish migrating north. So my question is, are they migrating north or are they expanding north?
Probably I think it's more towards, I'll call it relocating, at least from the science we've seen thus far. So the fish stocks are about...
And that would concern me a little bit, because if we're talking about food stock, 20, 30 years when food will be a strategic weapon in the world, we want to make sure that the U.S. has its food supply secure. Finally, I would just say, planning for the future. What can we do as a committee to make sure that we inform our public, our constituents, our colleagues of your important, and not only of the region, but of the Coast Guard? Just got back from New Zealand. Those folks were talking raving reviews about the Coast Guard on how they work on these vast swaths of water to protect, to rescue folks. Then we look at North Korea, how you are involved in the blockade, okay, of North Korea to make sure that we're enforcing international law. You're working everywhere, South America, Central America, Caribbean, yet your resources are very limited. How can we get that message out to our colleagues that we need to take care that you do have the resources and the assets to do your job?
Well, thank you for your observations, Mr. Chairman. I think, as we look over the support of that we've received, the resources recently, the thing that we come back to is talking about our readiness. And readiness allows us to take resources from New England and surge them down to the Gulf Coast to respond to a hurricane. It's what allows us to do this Arctic work. And so when we talk about readiness, that's the kind of the day-to-day operational and maintenance funding that the Congress provides us. And while the Department of Defense got a plus up of about 12% as they plussed up their readiness, we were not much above flatline. And so if I was going to, focus on one thing in a general subject, it's operational and maintenance funding to go towards improving our day-to-day readiness.
And now, Ranking Member Lesko.
No further questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bishop?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, Mr. Murphy, you offered some helpful comments about sort of the overall picture and it being a gradual and intentional process to expand resources, consulates, icebreakers, but many other things. I'm curious how, whether there's a similar process going on vis-a-vis allies. So you have on this sheet of the icebreakers that was made reference to earlier, Canada, the Nordic states, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, they're all making investments. They seem rather modest. Can you characterize, and of course we're looking at icebreakers here, there are a lot, but can you characterize that picture too? You mentioned the Arctic Council, and I assume we do work, all those nations do work there, but are our allies engaged, and are they prepared to expend the resources that the United States is expected to expend to respond to this problem?
That's a good question, and I think the answer to that question is yes. I mean, there's been a tremendous bump in investment in shared burden-sharing challenges by the allies over the last several years, and that's a real positive. And this administration deserves a lot of credit for effecting that change. But I also see, to use a specific example, in the context of dealing with some of the emerging military challenges that the Russians are posing in the Arctic and the North Atlantic, you see the Icelanders, for example, making investments in the Keflavik platform, which we're using with our allies to conduct P-8 missions. You've seen the Norwegians making investments in sensor technology in other areas so we know what is going on, situational and domain awareness. The United Kingdom is going to get back into the P-8 anti-submarine warfare mission, something it had gotten out of at the end of the Cold War. So there are changes taking place. They take longer to come online than we would all like, but they are happening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Vandrew?
Just one quick question and one remark. Ms. Mack, you said, that obviously we have to get these things accomplished and done before it's too late. And I agree with you, by the way, but what would you characterize as too late? Just complete control of the area by all these other nations, or how would you characterize that?
My perspective is really from an acquisition perspective, and really meaning that as the Coast Guard is pursuing the Polar Security Cutter, it needs to do things the right way and have the right appropriate knowledge before it moves forward to construction. Because we've seen a lot of work in our shipbuilding reviews where there's pressure to move forward and award construction. They start building the ship before design's complete numerous times on Navy ships and Coast Guard ships. Ends up costing more and taking longer in the long run because they have to rework it, or a contractor has to pull a part out because the design got changed later on. And all that ends up, there's a lot of back and forth, and it ends up taking a lot longer and costing longer. As a nation, as a country that needs to project in the Arctic, I think we can't afford to have those kind of delays. So we are asking the Coast Guard to be committed, and they have shown indications of that, to do it right the first time around.
Okay, thank you. And the chairman had made note of how much the Coast Guard is doing all over the world and with limited resources and how amazing it is. And I would just remind him that their initial training is in Cape May, New Jersey, so that might explain part of it.
Are you arguing for more training or less?
I'm arguing for anything I can get down there.
Good answer. I want to thank our members of the committee, our witnesses for their valuable testimony. Members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and I'd ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions when they do present them. And without objection, the committee record will be kept open for 10 days. Seeing no further business for this committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.